Hello and welcome to this evening. My name is Sami. I'm a representative for Rethinking Sweden, Rethinking Economics Sweden, that is. We're a newly formed organization that have three purposes. One is to engage with scholars around Sweden to start rethinking organizations at different universities in order to facilitate for a more pluralistic perspective on economics education. The second is that we want to engage with academics at PhD students and stuff at the universities in order to facilitate for a more pluralistic education program. And the third purpose is to invite and host awesome scholars like Peter Victor here to present different perspectives on economic theory. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Rethinking Economics Uppsala.
Thank you. First of all, we would like to thank the library for having us here on short notice. And we would also like to thank Siemens, which put a lot of effort in this event, helping us arrange everything. And I would like to say something very short about Peter. Peter is a professor and the former dean of York University in Canada. He is the author of a book called Managing Without Growth, which was published in 2008. And the second part of his book is going to be published this year. So we are all looking forward to listen about it, and he's probably going to tell us more about it today, and about future scenarios and how can we have maybe a sustainable future scenario. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. On a day like this, I especially value the choice you've made to come and participate in this event rather than enjoy the sunshine. I just hope that you don't regret it. As was explained, wrote this book, Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. It was published in 2008. My research on it really began in a funny sort of way when I was a graduate student in British Columbia, Canada, back in the 1960s. I'd come over there from England to study and never really went back, so I made my life in Canada. And my whole career has been concerned with the way economics and environment interact. And about 2001, 2002, started working on the question of, is there an alternative viable future for countries like Canada and Sweden and other advanced economies which didn't have to rely on economic growth to fulfill the really important objectives in life. So as I said in the introduction, I have a second edition that will be published later this year, and part of my work involves trying to simulate alternative futures so that discussions about what's possible could be informed by that kind of work. And I'm going to present some of these simulations that really haven't been seen by more than perhaps 50 people to this point to you tonight. But before we get there, I'm going to give you some background material. So, in a way, economics is a form of storytelling. Economists have taken up positions in society where they have become, in some ways, the main storytellers. And part of that story is that progress and economic growth are intimately related. So much so that sometimes we forget that progress is a much richer concept than simply an expanding economy. But I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but I can surmise in Canada, if we are able to report an increase in gross domestic product, the measurement of the output of goods and services, quarter over quarter, everyone's happy. And if there's a decline, well, this is bad news. Well, I don't think it's as simple as that. In fact, the idea of progress is a very rich idea. It goes back about 500 years in our cultures. But the idea that growth should be so important is a relatively new idea. You can sort of put it into the 1950s, 1960s. And one point that illustration that highlights that is this is the founding meeting of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which all developed countries belong to. And in their Articles of Association, the very first one says, the aims of the OECD shall be to promote policies designed to achieve the highest sustainable economic growth and employment. This was really one of the very first formal statements by these countries that economic growth was going to be a leading priority. Eventually, it really became the primary priority for many, many governments. So how's the OECD done? Well, this graph goes from 1970 pretty much up to the present time, and this is the total economic output of the OECD countries. You can see the massive expansion of output year after year, and even the so-called Great Recession, the financial crisis. It went down, but look, it sort of pretty much got caught up again. So from the vantage point of the OECD and its founding principles, there's been tremendous success. Well, there's another way of telling this story. So my book in 2008 examined growth in a number of ways. First of all, I took up the question of whether growth is possible over the long term. And there are various lines of argument which call that proposition into question. The first concerns the sources of materials and energy that growth depends upon, and how long we can keep expanding the requirements for materials and energy that we take from the earth to use to stimulate our economy. If we take too much, and then put it back, of course, the stuff gets used and then thrown away, we overuse the sinks, the capacity of the biosphere to accept our waste products. And when we do that, the surfaces that humans and other species depend upon for life get undermined. And so the whole set of literature on that growth over the long term is called into question. The second line of argument is there's another literature which suggests that beyond a certain level of income, there's not much evidence to show that getting richer makes people happier. And the third line of argument in the book was that when you look at the claims that are made for growth, that we need growth for full employment, we need growth to eliminate poverty, we need growth to fund all sorts of public services, you see that those promises have not been fulfilled. There have been some good things, but the promise of growth I don't think has been met. So those were the sort of lines of argument in the book. Now let's just look at quickly at some data. This goes from 1900 to 2015. I'm afraid there are a lot of graphs in my presentation. If any of you have a real hard time with graphs, I apologize in advance, but they can be very effective for showing trends over time, which is basically how I use them. So this shows the global materials extraction over that, just over more than a century. So if you look at the first half of the 20th century, you see a steady increase in the use of all of these kinds of materials: biomass, fossil fuels, iron ores and minerals, and construction materials, which captures all components of the materials that we take in from the environment. And it grew at an average annual rate of about 1.5% a year. Then look at the second half of the 20th century. You can see how much more materials we were using in the year 2000 to run the global economy. Of course, not equally, very unequal world, but looked at from the planetary standpoint, we're taking in all this, and it all ends up back in the biosphere, pretty much. And then, for this century, it's got even faster. Well, it shouldn't surprise anybody that drawing from the biosphere all of these materials, including the fossil fuels, we begin to overload the capacity of the biosphere to accommodate the wastes. The world owes a lot to Sweden because Sweden has introduced the concept of planetary boundaries. Joachim Rockström and friends identified 9 major global concerns, which was climate change, novel entities, which could be natural or manufactured, stratospheric ozone depletion, so on, all the way around. And they have proposed that, well, of course, we have to live on the planet, but there's what they call a safe operating space for humans inside that blue circle. And then they've defined that scientifically, and then for each of them tried to say, well, how are we doing? Well, you can see for several of these problem areas, we've gone beyond the safe operating space for humanity. So it's very important, I think, to connect in your mind what we take from the biosphere, use, and then dispose of fundamental laws of physics say we can't create or destroy matter or energy, so it all has to go somewhere. What's this done for other species? Well, this is a very troubling picture. Each square shows 1 million tons of mammalian biomass, or flesh, if you like, flesh and bones. And this is humanity. And the others show categories of animals that are there because of humans, at least on the kind of scale you see, as cattle, pigs, sheep, so on. But there's one category of mammals, land mammals, that's missing from this. Has anybody noticed? All the wildlife. So let's put the wildlife on there. So we've got this problem. More than a problem. I think it's been called the sixth extinction. And I think humanity is going to have a lot to answer for what we've done to other species. And it's very much related to the extent to which we keep trying to expand our economies. We convert land. When we do that, we destroy habitat. We make it very difficult for other species. So now, quickly to the second stream. And there's lots more to say about each of these, so I'm going to go quite fast. I hope you don't mind. This is a graph from 1945, again, virtually to the present. And it's based on US data. On that axis over there, we have the percentage of Americans who describe themselves as very happy. Don't ask what they mean by it. They're given a choice how happy they think they are. There's a certain percentage who say, well, I'm very happy. But over here we have real per capita gross domestic product. That's real per person output of goods and services in the economy. So starting in 1945, you can see that although the lines don't move together, the red line being real income per person and the blue line being percentage very happy, they haven't parted company in a dramatic way. But now look what happens after that. So all this growth in income isn't showing up in the way Americans describe their lives. So, to summarize, this is the kind of thing we're promised: beautiful car, open road, uncrowded, and this is what we get. This is taken about 5 kilometers from where I live in Toronto, and it's not an unusual circumstance. If you've come with me this far, you might understand why now there are calls for different kinds of growth. Not giving up on growth. We want green growth, or climate-friendly growth, or inclusive growth, and so on. There's a literature behind each of these. I didn't make these slogans up. Now, each one reveals something. It reveals, to me at any rate, that the growth that we're used to isn't green, isn't climate-friendly, isn't inclusive, and so on and so on. So I think that the only reasonable conclusion to draw from what I've shown you very quickly is that we need a new story. The mainstream, conventional story isn't satisfactory anymore. What I'm just going to spend a few moments on is green growth, because it is perhaps the one most widely looked to. OECD has a position on it, the World Bank does, trying to promote green growth. This is just taken from the internet. You Google green growth and endless stuff shows up on it. Here's the definition of green growth from the OECD. It means promoting economic growth. Growth is always number one, while reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, minimizing waste and inefficient use of natural resources, and maintaining biodiversity. It's a really attractive goal. The only problem is they really haven't taught us in any sensible way how to fulfill it, how to meet it. It's just something we somehow should be striving for. Now, I'm going to suggest to you reasons for being very skeptical that we can actually fulfill this objective. First of all, a little bit of history. From 1990 to 2000, goes to 2008, what this shows is OECD's GDP, and it shows domestic material consumption. That looks very promising, doesn't it? That the countries in the OECD have grown their economies. Let me get back to that picture. I'm talking about it. Sorry, press the wrong thing here. They've grown their economies, but they're not using anything like, they don't see the same increase in materials taken from within the OECD. And why is that? Of course, we're bringing in materials from outside the OECD. If you look at what they call the material footprint, you capture all of the materials used by OECD countries, directly or indirectly, to support this GDP. There's been no decoupling. There's been none of this separation of growth in GDP and the amount of materials we use. as is called for by green growth. I could put it down to jet lag. Okay, so what's gone wrong? Well, we're all aware of the fantastic progress made in technology. That's what a computer looked like the year I was born. I don't actually personally remember it, but the photos of that date. By the time I did my PhD in economics, it's color, which is nice, and it was a much more powerful machine. I was able to do some interesting work, I believe, using that. Coming forward to 1998, this is what a computer looked like, and now, well, there are many different forms. There's a tablet. All this is about miniaturization. It's been incredible. And there's a tendency, though, to think that miniaturization lessens the burden on the environment. The problem is that miniaturization makes other things possible. For example, these are people down here, by the way. This is the world's largest earth-moving machine. And it wouldn't be possible to design it, to build it, or to operate it without miniaturization. So just because we can do some things very small doesn't mean we stop doing things that are very large. Here's another one, the world's largest cruise ship. And here's what the engineer said about this cruise ship. I would say this is the most environmentally friendly cruise ship to date. It is much more efficient than other similar ships. And the reason they're saying that is because it carries so many people that the energy per person is actually lower than on a smaller ship. But imagine it landing on one of those Caribbean islands, and however many thousands of people get off, it's not that environmentally friendly. More to the point, though, is that just becoming more efficient does not solve our problem. And this was recognized back in the mid-19th century by William Jevons, who was a mining engineer before he became an economist. And he says this: "It is wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth." What he was saying is that if you make a machine more efficient, you make its use cheaper, people want to buy more of them, and it can overwhelm the savings in efficiency. So finally, I want to show you this graph. This shows the rate of economic growth of an economy from 0 to 4%, and this shows the rate of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions intensity. That's greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP. And the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions we have depends upon the size of your economy, which is here, and its efficiency, greenhouse gas per dollar. Now, how do we use this combination? Let's suppose we have an economy growing at 3% a year for 35 years, and the greenhouse gas per dollar of output is declining at 8% a year. That's an incredibly fast rate. We've never witnessed it. But if we were able to achieve that, in 35 years, greenhouse gas emissions from this economy would be down by 85%. That's the kind of target the world is setting itself. However, if we don't reduce intensity at 8%, let's say we only reduce it at 4%, which would be remarkable. Every year, 4% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP, we'd only reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 33%. And of course, if we decarbonize only 2%, look, greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up, even though we claim, well, we're getting more efficient. Now, if we maintain that 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per year, but don't grow the economy so fast, in fact, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by even more. The point I want to make here is there's this intimate relationship between the growth rate of the economy and the level of increase in efficiency that we have to achieve to get some goal. I fill this whole thing out. The red ones are scary because they represent an absolute increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and the greener it gets, the better it gets. Now, if we grow faster, the story's even worse. That's a lot of numbers to look at. I don't expect to remember them, but there's a nice rule of thumb. If you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% in 35 years, then the rate of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions intensity must exceed the rate of growth by 5%. So if the rate of growth is 0, you've got to have a reduction. You can get by with a reduction in intensity of only 5% a year. If the faster your economy grows, the faster this has to come down. So I don't believe the green growth story is going to suffice. We need another story. Well, the story that I and others have been developing over the last many years was very much, and certainly in my case, influenced by this picture. We began to see this in the 60s, photographs of planet Earth taken from outside the planet. And I, as an economics student, thought, well, what does that mean for economics? And what does that mean for the economy that's taking place on planet Earth? Now, I looked at my textbook, and by the way, if you open up textbooks in economics today, very often you'll find a picture that looks like that. Firms and households. The firms sell goods and services to the households for money, and the households own, ultimately, the land, labor, and capital used by firms to make the goods and services for which they get paid. And so you have this cycle. And economics has investigated that cycle as many ways as you could imagine. But there's something missing. Where's the biosphere? Where are all those materials that the economy requires? The energy, where did the waste go? So, oh, by the way, I can make it move, isn't that nice? Little cycle. Something's got moved around here. I don't know how this is supposed to be down here, but the point is that these parts of the biosphere provide the materials and energy to the firms and households. As I've already explained, that materials and energy finally gets disposed of into the biosphere and overloads some of the sinks that are there to receive it. That can interfere with the biophysical cycles which are affecting the supply of materials. And all that takes place on planet Earth, which only has solar heat or solar energy and waste heat coming in and going out. And what ecological economists do is we always do our economic analysis with this picture in mind, or some representation like this, never losing sight of the materials and energy required to make the system work. And if you don't remember anything else from what I say this evening, it would be nice to remember this, because if your economic commentaries in the media are anything like ours in Canada, they always forget the container that the economy takes place in. So back in 2007, 2008, I decided to try to simulate the Canadian economy in order to answer this question. Can we have full employment, low poverty, fiscal balance, that means taxes and expenditures roughly equal, reduce greenhouse gas emissions without relying on economic growth? And the sort of conclusion I reached, I did a projection from 2005 to 2035, with everything indexed to 100, shows something like this. GDP per capita eventually stabilizing, greenhouse gas emissions declining, unemployment coming down, the poverty rate in the country coming down, and the government's debt to GDP ratio coming down. But very briefly, how did that happen? Balanced trade, Canada would not have a net deficit or surplus on trade. Lower investment, because we don't want to keep building equipment to make the economy more productive, and the population would be stabilized. Greenhouse gas emissions come down because I imposed a carbon price, which you had in Sweden for a long time on greenhouse gases, a world leader in that. Unemployment comes down because I assumed a shorter work year. Reduced work, share it out more. For the poverty index to come down, a number of anti-poverty programs are included. Now, this was not considered anything like mainstream, so I did begin to wonder whether there was any chance of this sort of view, perspective, entering the mainstream. Lo and behold, I came across a quote by Robert Solow, one of the most eminent economists in the second half of the 20th century, most famous for the work he did on economic growth. And in 2008, he said this: "It is possible that the US and Europe will find that either continued growth will be too destructive to the environment, and they are too dependent on scarce natural resources, or that they would rather use increasing productivity in the form of leisure." It's just a nice verbal statement of the graph that I've just shown you. Well, I felt pretty pleased when I read that. Well, I've done my model, it seems to be consistent with what an eminent scholar like Solow was saying, and then financial crisis hit. And I thought, whoops, I don't think I have finance in the model. Well, it's there, but in a very minor way. So clearly, the story wasn't good enough, needed a new one. So, here's me, that, 2008, and I wrote this book, and I met this gentleman, Tim Jackson, who some of you either have met or have read his work. He wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth. And we thought, well, two economists who put without growth in the titles of our book, we must have something in common. So we met in this restaurant in London, England, and we thought, well, could we develop something we would call ecological macroeconomics? The story of the big picture, that's important, but with this ecological awareness and consciousness built into it, so that we could look at alternative economic futures. Let me try and explain a little bit of the scope of what we've set out to do. This is the real economy, as it's sometimes called, where labour and capital are used to produce goods and services. That's the main focus of most economists, not all, but most. But it doesn't have anything there about the environment or about finance. So ecological economics has done a number of things to integrate the natural systems with the economy. So you've got, in that case, a barrel of oil going in, and you've got waste coming out. And we've used physical laws to monitor and measure that. Tim and I also discovered some very interesting work that had been going on in finance. It wasn't mainstream, has now become much more popular because the people working on modern money theory did anticipate the financial crisis, but they were considered a sort of a fringe group. Trouble is, they didn't have any conception of environment here. So they're still wedded to making the economy grow, but taking account of finance. Well, what we've done, and others now, have tried to integrate all three components, at least to some degree. So that's what I want to talk about now. We have a new version of the model called LOGRO. It's now called LOGRO SFC, isn't that obscure? That stands for Stock Flow Consistency. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but it means that we track all the monetary payments and receipts in the economy, and we track all the financial liabilities and assets in the economy, because they all have to balance. If they don't balance, something's wrong with your model. And the idea was so that we could explore possible futures encompassing economic, social, and environmental considerations. Now, this is a nice little picture. I didn't draw this, and I hope I'm not breaking any copyright rules by using it. It shows a little boy looking out at the real world. What we do in our simulation model is work with stuff like this. Something gets lost on the way. We hope that the model helps us understand the real world, but we must never, and I say this to myself all the time, forget that our models are always simplifications. They never capture all that everybody or anybody might think is important. But if they're good models, then they are useful simplifications, and they help us understand what's going on in the broader system. We use an approach called system dynamics. Not very widely used by economists, but I hope that will change. It consists of stocks. So I've got a very simple example here. This is a population, number of people in a village or in a country. It goes up with births. It comes down with deaths. If you have a birth rate, the number of children born per thousand of the population, then you only need the number of people, the birth rate, and you can calculate the births. But the birth rate can also depend upon the size of the population. It's exactly symmetrical with the death rate, or deaths and the death rate. But here's the interesting thing. I hope you can follow this, that obviously population depends on births and deaths, and birth rate and death rate. It's these feedbacks that make it really hard just in your brain to work out how this model would behave, how population would change over time. What the computer allows us to do is to simulate that, make different assumptions about the death rate and how it is dependency on population. And of course it could depend on many other things as well. That's why we do our simulation modeling. So now, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself too much, but I want to give you some idea. The trouble with models is they're great for the people who build them, but for other people, they're just a mystery. What's on earth going on inside the black box? So I'm going to tell you a bit about what's inside the black box. We calculate GDP, gross domestic product, in a very simple way. It's labor productivity, which is the output per person, multiplied by however many people are employed. Has to be true. This times this equals this. And we do it for the economy broken down into the business sectors and the non-business, government, NGO sectors. What determines labour productivity? Well, one of the big determinants of labour productivity is how much capital does a worker have to work with. If you've got to dig a hole with your hands, you don't dig very big holes. Someone gets a shovel, it's much more efficient, more capital. You apply a mechanical digger to the one person, you can move a lot of earth. So the amount of capital is a major determinant of labour productivity. But so are other factors like the educational level of the population, the organisation and so on. And turns out the amount of output that accrues to capital is another determining factor. So that's all this is in the model. What determines the amount of capital? Well, the investment in new capital, the purchase of new equipment, the purchase of new buildings, construction of roads. And the more your gross domestic product is, the more you can divert expenditures into those things. That increases capital, increases labour product, and you get this growth happening in the economy. In our model, as I mentioned very briefly, we go beyond just this, and we add in balance sheets for the sectors. We keep track of all the transactions between sectors, and we represent the banks. And our money is created and destroyed. We break out the electricity sector because part of the transition to a more sustainable economy, in many people's thinking, is a greater use of electricity, especially from renewable sources, to displace oil and gas and coal. So we wanted to look at that, and the best way to do it was to expand the sector within here that is electricity. Then we introduced green investment. Some investment is actually good for the environment. Pollution control equipment, sewage treatment plants, and then some investment protects us against problems such as building seawalls or higher bridges, so if the sea level rises, you don't destroy the bridge. So we allow for some investment to go into the creation of green capital, which can take on all different forms, including forests, for example, but also manufactured capital. And we distinguish about whether the green capital is paid for in addition to regular investment, or is a diversion of regular investment. But we also distinguish between whether it's profitable or unprofitable. But we need some way of measuring what all this is doing to the environment. So we have what we call the Environmental Burden Index. The more green capital, the more we've put into protecting the environment, the lower this is going to go. But the bigger the economy is, the higher this is going to get. So you know, there's a tension there. And depending upon what's happening with the electricity sector, the more we go into renewables, the better it will be here than if we use coal in particular. And finally, we have an index which tells us how the overall system's working. It's called the Sustainable Prosperity Index. It's going to be affected by the Environmental Burden Index, but also GDP, consumption matters, and also some financial measures go into it. So what I'm going to do now is describe three scenarios that we've modeled using this logic. And I have to say, the model itself is a lot more complicated than this, but this is the basic set of connections that are at work inside it. So in the first case, we say what would happen if the trends in Canada of the past 30 years or so were just to continue in the future. I'm not saying that's going to happen, I don't think it will happen, but it's a way of giving us a baseline against which we can compare alternatives. So we have a scenario of that sort, and then we have a scenario which says, let's get really tough on greenhouse gas emissions. Let's really work hard to reduce them. We'll put a carbon price on greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation. We'll have serious greenhouse gas abatement by all the other industrial sectors, and we'll electrify road and rail transport. Now, we ought to be able to bring greenhouse gases down a long way if we do those things. And then the third scenario includes all this. We switch from brown to green investment to a substantial degree. We increase transfer payments to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty. We have a lower rate of population growth, and we reduce work hours. So that's the third scenario. We call that our sustainable prosperity scenario. So now, we get some results. And in each of these graphs, you're going to see a black line, which is the base case, a red line, which is the greenhouse gas reduction case, and the green line, the green line is the sustainable prosperity case. Up there we have GDP, here's the unemployment rate, and here's the debt to GDP ratio, government debt to GDP. Now I'm not going to tell you that the sustainable prosperity scenario wins out in every case. If it did, it would make life a lot easier, but we have choices to make, and of course there are many other scenarios that could be generated by the model if we change some assumptions. So let's look at this. This is the base case. There's your continuing economic growth. Unemployment comes down a little bit, pretty much stable, and the debt to GDP ratio is stabilized. Our current government would be very happy with that. Here's the greenhouse gas reduction scenario. We don't get so much economic growth. And the reason for that is because we've imposed a high carbon price, the utilities are putting more money into renewables than they would have done otherwise. It's more expensive for them. So more capital is going into generating electricity than would otherwise be the case. If that's taken from other sources, then it lowers the growth rate. Less capital, labour productivity doesn't rise so much. So that's all factored in here. Unemployment is virtually unaffected, and so is the debt to GDP ratio. I want to point out that other economists have come to a different conclusion about this, but I think I understand the reasons for the difference. Then we have the sustainable prosperity scenario. Growth has come to an end. But just to be clear, Canadians will be receiving incomes higher than they do at present. This is an impoverishment scenario. Unemployment rate's a little bit higher. Debt to GDP ratio has risen. It's not outlandishly high, it's not gone above 100%, but it's not a plus for that particular scenario. Now let's look at some social indicators. It's all coming from the same model. The Gini coefficient is a widely used measure of income inequality. If it equals 1, that's complete inequality. If it equals 0, that's complete equality. So you see I've put on the upright axis, it can go from 0 to 1. What I assumed was that if there's no new measures taken, it won't change over time. Again, that's not very realistic, but it's a place to start for a point of comparison. Then we have annual hours worked, and then we have households loan to value. That refers to how much debt households carry in relation to the value of their assets. So let's see how the three scenarios compare. In the business as usual case, households become slightly more indebted in relation to their assets. In the greenhouse gas scenario, a little bit better here, but small differences don't mean anything really. But here's the sustainable prosperity index. Now, we're putting a lot of money into reducing inequality. And it pays off in terms of that, that's what it's for. Average annual hours worked come down a lot, that's deliberate. We believe that's a good thing. And households, in terms of this particular measure, actually a bit better off. Environmental indicators. So we have greenhouse gas emissions, our environmental burden index, which includes everything, not just greenhouse gases, and the proportion of renewable energy, because that's something of great interest and affects greenhouse gas emissions. So there's the business as usual case. That's a disaster scenario. If all countries, rich countries, follow something like this, greenhouse gas emissions rising inexorably over the next 50 years. I won't see it, but those of you who'll be there whenever 2067, I don't envy you. It shows up in the environmental burden index, also going to rise terribly. And in Canada, what it says is that the proportion of renewable electricity in our system will actually come down and then increase slightly over there. It's because we've used up most of our large hydro sites, and solar are not particularly competitive. Here's the greenhouse gas reduction scenario. You see, we really can bring greenhouse gases down, even though the economy grows almost as fast. We saw that. The GDP didn't drop very much. But the environmental burden index rises, and the reason for that is because, in our assumptions, greenhouse gases only represent 25% of all the environmental problems we face. Now, you might want to pick a different number. You might say that's too low. It should be 50%. Others would say it's too high. But we took that from the Environmental Performance Index of Yale University, where they've got a comprehensive, not complete, but comprehensive index of environmental performance, and they give greenhouse gases and energy a 25% weight, so we use that. But the carbon price, you see what it does for renewable energy. We get a lot more of our electricity from renewables because now utilities make a different calculation. They can avoid the carbon price if they go into renewables. So that's what they choose to do. And there's the sustainable prosperity option. Greenhouse gas emissions come down even faster because we're not growing so much, the economy is not so big. The environmental burden index actually declines. So we get that sort of increase for a while and then steady state level of economic output, and we're able still to sustain a reduction in environmental impact. That's really important. and we get a bit higher proportion of our electricity from renewables. I've mentioned a couple of times the financial side. I only have the one slide on it, which makes a very key point. In an economy, what one person or one sector lends, somebody else must be borrowing. Lending and borrowing are mirror images of each other. So what I did for this, I divided the economy into the private sector, which includes households and businesses, and it also includes the rest of the world, and the public sector, which is all government. And I said, well, okay, let's see what happens in these scenarios to private sector borrowing or lending versus public sector borrowing or lending. And it's just a useful way to illustrate the symmetry. So here's the base case. So it's perfectly symmetrical. What the private sector lends, it's the blue line that's positive above zero, the public sector borrows. Public sector is not borrowing, then the private sector as a whole cannot be lending, cannot be saving. Isn't that interesting? Here's the greenhouse gas scenario, much the same. In the sustainable prosperity scenario, we get this convergence. Not a lot of net borrowing, net lending in, between private and public sector. So now to sort of evaluate these scenarios, there are lots of different measurements coming out. So we developed the Sustainable Prosperity Index, SPI. It goes up with GDP per capita. So the more people have in terms of income or access to the output, if that grows, we're saying that's actually a good thing, if that's the only thing that's happening. And so we've put that into the index, but everything else, if it rises, unfortunately makes the index go down. So we have the unemployment rate. If the unemployment rate goes up, this index is going to go down. If this measure of income inequality goes up, this index is going to go down. If the government debt to GDP ratio goes up, as it did in the sustainable prosperity scenario, then this is going to go down. If household loans to value, that's the indebtedness of households in relation to their financial assets, or all assets rather, goes up, then this goes down. If the average hours worked goes up, we say this goes down. We think shorter work hours are better because you have more time for all the other things that make life important. And finally, the environmental burden index. If that index goes up, then this is going to go down. So, what happens? This is the Sustainable Prosperity Index, again from 2017 to 2067. Here's the business as usual case. We kind of plod along for about 10, 15, 20 years, but then as the environmental burden, in particular, gets higher and higher, our overall measure of how we're doing drops right off. This is a very unpleasant future. The greenhouse gas scenario is better, but still, Canadians would be worse off than they are now if we only attend to greenhouse gases. And the Sustainable Prosperity Index gives us some meaningful sense of progress. But it's not progress based on economic growth, it's progress based upon all of the other social and environmental considerations that go along with this. So, we do have a new story, but let's not forget that we live in a very, very unequal world. My work is almost exclusively focused on rich countries. I could explain that later in the Q&A if you want. But I take this position that because of these extreme inequalities, the rich countries should go first in changing our priorities. This is an illustration of the extreme difference in living standards in 4 parts of the world. This is a European country, not this one, but that's a week's food for this family. It's Germany, I think. This is Ecuador, a week's food for this family. This is Bhutan, and this is Chad. And I know this isn't the right thing to say, but there are only 3 families that are smiling, one that isn't. You can find that yourself. Now, so I think we have to make a choice. This is my graphic, and it's a very meaningful one. We can head off in that direction, continue really in that direction, or we can try something else. But it's not a choice that's going to be made by people of this vintage, although we've been sort of, some of us been pushing for it. It's going to be made by people more like this, like many of the people in this room. I think if we make the wrong choice, we're looking at a very bleak future, heading into the storm. But it's not the only future. I do think there's a much brighter future out there. But, as I said, there's the second edition of a book coming out later this year. It's 10 years after the first one. And I do think that the window of opportunity for making some substantially different choices about what we want to do in our respective countries is closing. And it hasn't closed yet, but I do think it's just got that much harder because we've done so little in the last 10 years. But game is not over. The world is involved. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things that I haven't taken into account perhaps. So let's not feel that we don't have choices. I hope that the main message of what I've tried to put to you, that we do have some serious choices. They will entail, I think, some substantial changes to what we've become accustomed to in the last half century or so, but we better get on with it. Thank you very much for your attention. So now I believe it's a Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. Yes, we'll start Q&A, and since I have the microphone, I'll exercise my authority to take the first question of myself. Yes, thank you. GDP played a lot into your slides, I noticed, and I'm just curious, some of us in our circle, we've kind of on the GDP bashing train lately. And I'm just curious, when you showed that later slide of the SPI, you had GDP per capita still going up. So I'm just curious, you said this in another part of the presentation as well, that there has to be some growth, it seems like, right? And so I'm just curious, do you think that some level of economic growth, while it can be sustainably steered, does need to be still, in a per capita basis, needs to be maintained or at some level of increase in GDP for these models to work?
Okay, thanks for the question. Look, I use GDP because I think it's really important to link to the mainstream discussion. The mainstream discussion about economic policy in economic journalism, taught in economic departments, focuses on GDP. And so that's why it's there. Secondly, look around us, this beautiful building. Look how comfortably you're sitting, look at my computer. It all happened because of economic growth. It would be silly to sort of, let's give it the back of our hands and say, it doesn't mean anything to us. So what we've done though, and I have to credit Tim Jackson, with my collaborator on this work, is to try to put it in context and say GDP tells us something of that's useful to us, but it's not the whole story by any stretch of the imagination. So that's why it's still in the model. The other thing is GDP drives so many other things. It's a measure of how much we produce and how much we consume, which is directly related to the materials and energy we use, which has environmental implications. So I mean, it'd be hard to think of how we would model an economy excluding GDP. At least I think I'll leave that for someone else to do. I showed you a scenario, what I call the sustainable prosperity scenario, with a sort of a gentle transition to a steady state measured by GDP. Other things are changing, of course, but that isn't a steady state. The model is quite capable of generating a decline in GDP as a scenario, but when I'm sort of thinking what am I going to present to people, that just seems to be the one to focus on. Eventually the model will be put up on the internet so people can use it, change assumptions, and see what difference it makes. Let me just make one really key point. I've done this stuff for a long time. The real output of these models is your thinking and your understanding. It's not the numbers that come out of the computer. When you fool around with a simulation model that allows you to change something and see what effect it has, it can help you. First of all, you think that when you're building the model, oh my God, I made a mistake, the model's crap, it's no good. Or it might be teaching you something. And as you work with it more and more, you get more confidence in it, and you really think it's teaching you something when something happens you don't expect. So I encourage you eventually, when you get a chance to use the model, try it for yourself and see how it affects your thinking about what our alternatives are and what our options are. So I'm not sure that's a precise answer to your question. GDP is there because it's what the conversation is all about today. It needs qualifying. That's why I do it that way.
Well, thank you. I mean, that does answer it. I mean, I could ask more, but I'll yield the floor to others. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. So if you have one, I'll try to run around and get as many people as I can. And we'll start with Carl over here.
Thank you, Peter, for the talk. It was really, really interesting. But I was just wondering about modeling. Does it include the environmental disasters and for example, the climate migrants and other type of things? Because this runs for 50 or 80 years, and the sea levels will rise, and the temperature of the globe will increase. So, yeah.
Well, yes, it does, but in a very in a way that's not very detailed. It's not a model which explicitly includes ecological models. It's not linked to an ecological model. There are people who do that, but what they generally do is a much less detailed analysis of what the economy is capable of doing. So rather than attempt that, in this case, I designed this environmental burden index. Started out with greenhouse gases because that's so current, and I like to try to address issues that other people say, yeah, that's interesting, I'd like to at least talk to you about it. And so the model does explicitly include estimates of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, greenhouse gas emissions are what's causing climate change, and it's just going to get worse. So the way this works is that the more the emissions go up, assuming something about what's going on in other countries, they're operating in the same way, then we're going to get those catastrophic results that you talk about. That's why the environmental burden index goes goes up so much, right? It's a way of saying it's bad. But greenhouse gas emissions is just, well, climate change is only a part of our environmental pressures. That planetary boundary diagram I showed you had 9 different environmental problems. So that's not a complete list. So I said, okay, well, what am I going to do about the other 75%? I'm not able to take, I mean, it's a huge problem. Take each one and somehow model cause and effect. So I said that we know that green investment in various things that I mentioned, and I put a list of them, for examples, in the book, will reduce the environmental burden. And I make some assumption about the effectiveness of doing that. The more green capital we have, whether that's biological or whether that's equipment, the less impact that economy will have on the biosphere. I made some assumption about that relationship and added that to the greenhouse gas part of the story, and you get the effect on the environmental burden index, which is why I'm able to claim that it's all in there, but it's not all in there in the kind of detail that might satisfy you. But sorry. But the good news is there's more work to be done. So some of you might want to take that up. But just to finish off, that scenario, the business as usual scenario where the index drops off like that, that's a real disaster. I mean, we're in a bad enough situation right now. I gave you a little bit of data, you probably know more than that. That would be horrific. And it didn't take much, actually, for me to do scenarios where it dropped right through the horizontal axis, but I didn't want to give people nightmares, so I didn't do that.
Got one here, and then I'll come up.
Okay, thanks for the talk. Just to bring you up there, when you asked us to ask you later about that you only concentrated on rich countries, is it possible to come up with a model of the future, or the Sustainable Prosperity Index, not taking into account then globalization, or the fact that poorer countries will still be trading with richer countries? Or just wanted to know a bit more about what you had to say about that. In your model, does global trade increase or decrease?
Right. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I tend to give longer answers than you might expect to what seems like a simple question. Look, it's the second time I've done this, well, we've actually done a few of these in other ways. National models are still really important because nations still get to make a lot of key decisions. So that's one reason for looking at a national economy. Plus, I like the models to be based in data, so not just abstract equations that allow maybe some general conclusions. So this model is heavily based on Canadian data. You can't do that so easily at the global level, because not all countries keep data in the same way. We use a lot of data that's available for Canada, probably would be available for Sweden, but it's not available for all countries. So that's a further obstacle. And thirdly, personally, I have a better understanding of how the Canadian economy functions than I could claim for any other economy, and certainly not for the global economy. I have some understanding, but when you build a model like this, you have to be explicit about relationships, about causal connections, about structure. So you have to know a fair bit about the system you're trying to represent. So where do the links to the globe come in? Well, Canada trades with the rest of the world. The key assumption that we make in the model is that the trade will be balanced. So Canada will export as much as it imports. We don't specify the level. We just say that will balance out, because it's actually, for those of you not familiar with gross domestic product, what goes into gross domestic product is the difference between exports and imports. If they balance, then they actually have no net effect on gross domestic product. So, but I also want to make another point. I'm motivated to do this work very much because of a concern for other poorer countries. And that's why I said at the end, I think it's up to the rich countries to go first. We need to set a different example. You can hardly fault poorer countries for pursuing consumerism when they see that's what we've done and seem to be enjoying it. And of course, if you come from a poor country, you come to Sweden, you come to Canada, you just think, oh, man, it's just amazing what we see. I just don't think that kind of physical infrastructure can be built and operated for now we're 7.7 billion people, rising to 10 or 11 billion people. It's just a pipe dream. So I think that the onus is on us, those of us who benefited so much from economic growth in the past, to rethink what we're doing, take the pressure off the biosphere, which my third scenario suggests can be done, leave more ecological space for poorer countries, and set a better example. So that's kind of where it joins. Now, as regards whether you could build such a model for developing countries or a developing country, I think quite possible. But that should be done by them, not by me. You need that intimate understanding of the system you're trying to model in order to do a good job. So I've been invited to make a presentation in India early next year, and they have an interest in trying to do something like that.
Thank you for the presentation. I was curious about these reduced work hours we were talking about, and the assumptions you make about what we will do with our leisure and how that will affect what we're able to consume, because you might think that with more leisure we have more time to go on holidays, consume more, etc.
Right, yes. Funny thing is I've retired. Look what I'm doing with my spare time. A lot of people are giving thought to how we might better spend our leisure time. And I, like so many aspects of this model, rely on them to really answer the kind of question you've asked. But I'm aware of the following. For example, if you ask people if they could choose to work fewer hours, even if it meant a reduction in income, would they choose that? And it's surprising, not of course everybody, because a lot of people feel they're very short of income, but quite a substantial number of people reply and say, yes, if I had that choice, but I'm driven now to work 60, 78, I've got a lawyer daughter, and I can see that in my own family, doesn't have the kind of discretion that she would like to have. So part of the answer is, for short hours, is to find ways in which people would have more choice over the number of hours they work. And that is becoming increasingly possible with the capacity we now have to work at home, that you don't have to be in a factory to produce things through mass production, as in the old days. As for how people would use their time, that's a really interesting question. And I look to education as part of the answer. I look to more regulation of advertising as part of the answer, because advertising is the main way, it can be argued, that our societies convey the values of the society. It's no longer religion, probably not education anymore, it's advertising. And so it's conveyed. You're not as bad as we are in Canada. You just go through your public places, going through the main station, you see the ads around there, sort of the examples of the good life being represented through more consumption. We've got to somehow do something about that. I think, limit advertising to children much more so than we do in Canada, and that's really good. It's just not enough. So there are all of these strands. Now, what then people will do with their increased spare time, the opportunities are endless, and they're not all high consumption activities. They can be sport, they can be crafts, they can be music, they can be theatre. I mean, they can just be spending time with friends, family. If we think of this sustainable prosperity scenario, it's not an impoverishment scenario, but it would mean less opportunity than otherwise to get on a plane and fly around the world and see places. That's true. It wouldn't eliminate it though. But what can I say? I think we have to, we're faced with really difficult choices. And to me, the pursuit of growth, which looked like it expands choices, because we consume more, in fact, when we look at all the other dimensions, is increasingly limiting choice. What's the point of being able to travel to a foreign country to see the wildlife if they're not there anymore? What's the point of travelling even to another country of comparable living standards to Sweden when it looks exactly the same? Same shops, same products, just a slightly different language. So some of that isn't real loss. So we're looking for people to provide creative solutions. I don't know, you may have an answer for yourself, how you would use more time. But it's something that we'll all have to try to answer.
So I jumped Andres earlier, and then we have the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then we have Dan. So Keith, if you want to sort of fight to the death in the corner for Q after that, we can do that. So we'll keep it going.
Thanks again. There is a clear gap because we all know that policymakers and leaders, they don't read this type of knowledge. So besides your talks and some demonstrations here and there, do you think, are you doing something to, or lobbying in some kind of way so this knowledge reach those leaders taking the decisions? And second, really fast, is you mentioned that there was a gap in your first model or research about economic crisis. And for example, Krugman and Stiglitz, they've been writing about euro crackdown at least last year. So you consider this time economic crisis again in this model?
Two very different questions. I've been fortunate in my career to have held very different kinds of positions. Private consultant, a government bureaucrat on two different occasions. Even as an academic, I would be invited to participate in some ways in public policy discussions. But my main way of proceeding is whenever I'm invited to give a talk, I always try to say yes. So that's what I do. Here's what I think could very well unfold. Growth rates in rich countries are slowing down and have been slowing down for quite a long time. Documented in my book, but other people have also begun to tell that story. Larry Summers, you might have seen, talks about a new era of secular stagnation. So what this means is that rich economies are going to have to come to terms with slower growth anyway. And that can open up opportunities for these kinds of ideas to be listened to in a way that would not be there if economies were growing at 3, 4, 5% a year and people focusing on the short term wouldn't worry so much. So I'm quite optimistic in that regard that there's a growing appetite for thinking about alternative futures. Because one of the problems we've got, if we don't do that, and economies don't grow so fast, we begin to see things that we're already seeing. And that is, well, who do we blame for that? We've got to blame somebody. Right? So we start blaming immigrants, we start blaming people who are different from ourselves, and so on. And that's really dangerous. So we need to seed the discussion with ideas that there are other alternatives from just continuing to push for economic growth. But look, one person can't possibly do all that. So I've been, as a teacher, helping other students, my students, to think along these lines and to use these tools. This idea of system dynamics is quite unusual amongst economists, but it's a very powerful way of building a view of a system, a representation of a system, which isn't just economic. I was asked a question before about environment. When environmental models lend themselves to system dynamics perfectly. Stocks of water, inflows of water, outflows of water, inflows of contaminants, outflows. I mean, you can do biological models with this method just as easily, possibly easier than economic. So that propagation of that tool is also valuable. But it's one of those things where, to the extent you accept the kind of story that I'm putting forward, that we have important choices, that we have alternatives, then it's up to all of us to push those ideas out through whatever opportunities we have. And the more we do that, I think the more the politicians will listen.
My question is a bit related to the last question. How do you think your model and Tim Jackson's model will be perceived by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the USA? Because in the end, the narrative you described in the beginning, it's basically power. To have that power to define what is the narrative, it's a huge power in the world. And so, do you understand the question? Because how do you perceive that, and how, because you talk about how do we implement it, because you kind of describe a bottom-up approach in a way. Is that enough? Because...
Yeah, great question. It's an open question, really. It sounds terribly arrogant, I don't mean it to be, but I think they're about 3 decades behind the times. The kind of thinking that they're showing now, like the OECD is interested in green growth. Probably goes back, 2011 is one of their big reports, so it's 7 years ago. Well, the ideas expressed in that report could have been written 30 years, at least, before then. So this is one of the problems we've got. There's a real lag between the emergence of sort of new thinking, and here we are rethinking economics, and the time it takes to have an effect on the people who are employed in those institutions and who end up leading them. I don't know if the window's closing. I don't know if there is enough time for that. Right now, I don't think they're very receptive. But I don't actually know who buys my book. But let me give you one encouraging example in a different field. There's a very good organization in Britain called the New Economics Foundation. Some of you may know it. If you don't, then I advise you to check their website. It's an NGO. And in 2012, they published a book called Where Does Money Come From? Now, most people who haven't thought about money think of it as paper money and coins. But in fact, in an economy like Canada's, I'm sure it would be the same in Sweden, well over 90% of the money does not come as coins and notes. It's created when banks make loans. If you go to a bank and they lend you money, they haven't lent you somebody else's money. They need to make an entry. Create the money by making the entry. And the book's always balanced and so on. Don't worry about that. So they write this book called Where Does Money Come From? And it's a very good book. It's a very readable account of what I put up there as modern money theory. So I was speaking to the ex-CEO of the organization about a year ago, and I said, well, that was a very good book. How did the sales? He said, well, the sales were pretty good. He said, but the thing that really surprised us was how many copies we sold in the Bank of England. Isn't that amazing? The Bank of England, one of the most famous central banks in the world, buy the book called Where Does Money Come From? If they don't know. So I don't quite know how I got on that. Well, right, so that's an example of a major institution, now headed by a Canadian, by the way, who needed help on understanding the system that they were operating. And I like to think that the kind of book I write, it's quite academic, and I footnote everything, and I respect previous authors and all of that, cite my sources, does get bought by those institutions and people there, so it has an effect. There are lots of others saying somewhat similar things now. What distinguishes my work, or I say mine and Tim's work, is we try to do the modelling. The stories about resource use and environmental damage, all of that, that's drawn others for that, but the modelling is what's novel. And that's what can really make an impression, those kinds of organizations you mentioned, because they build computer models. And it would really help if more people would sort of get in touch with them and say, where's the environment in your model? Now, where's the social dimension in your model? Because we saw this guy in May who put some of those things in his model. We'd like to see it in your model. Make it different.
So we have, there, cut up. We have a lot of questions, which is great. We're getting a little short on time, so here's what I'll do if that's okay with you. There's 3 people here,
okay.
So maybe we can take them together, and then we'll go over there and so we can get covered. So I'll start with this lady, then Dan, and then this lady here, or these ladies, and then back to Dan.
Hello, my name is Annika Mollström. It's really interesting to listen to your speech. There is a lot of different theories around, also in Sweden, how to transfer the economy to a more ecological system, circular economy and everything. And the notion that the Bank of England bought your book in so many copies is very impressive, of course, but it also limits the distribution to all the rest of us, of course. I just wonder what is needed for people and nations to make the change. You have 2 different roads to choose from. And some would argue that it's necessary to sacrifice something for the good cause and to make this change. I don't know how you view the reason, how we will become aware of the fact that we need to make some kind of change and what for, and in case you find that a sacrifice would be needed.
Okay, I'm going to be, fine, I've got a memory problem here, I'll remember that question. What's the second question?
This lady here, then we'll get to that.
Well, in light of what you mentioned regarding population growth, the projections of 9 billion by mid-century is totally unthinkable. And well, do you have any ideas of how that will happen in view of China's policy, which is now abandoned, and India's similarly? How can that in fact happen? And also perhaps remember Rosling's work, which is a very optimistic one on how it will happen automatically by giving work opportunities and so on.
Yes. Okay.
Can you take one more?
It'd be better if I didn't have to. Could I just give answers to those? That'd be fairly brief.
Go those 2 and then I'll put
2 is all, it's kind of my limit for. Okay, so the sacrifice. 2 things I want to say about that. I just laid 3 different scenarios. The one that, to my mind, is most attractive doesn't require sacrifice except in a relative way. The GDP per person is lower than it would otherwise be, but it's not lower than it has been historically. But when people talk about sacrifice, it usually means somehow things are going to get worse and worse. So what I've shown, I hope, or suggested, is that we can transition to a situation where one generation expects to consume about at the same level as the previous one. Not more, but not less, and things improve in other respects. I think if that message was endorsed and seemed tested and seemed to be reasonably valid, it wouldn't be such a hard sell as saying everyone's got to consume less, which some do argue. So I don't think the sacrifice question in that respect is that problematic. The second thing I want to say is, I don't know what it's like here, but in Canada, more and more young people will say that they don't expect the same material standard of living as their parents. Now that's new. I mean, in the last 5-6 decades, maybe more, there's been this expectation that your standard of living, material terms, will be better than your parents. Now that's changing. Now that's not because anyone's made a conscious decision to sort of switch to a different track, but on the other hand, they are doing that. They're finding other, well, how can I put it? I think you can live with that tension and frustration that you're not as rich as your parents were, and be an unhappy person for your life, feeling, I've been cheated. Or you change your expectations. And that's what a lot of people do, faced with a change in circumstances. They change expectations because it makes for a sort of a more stable, a more reasonable way to be. And I think we're beginning to see that. Expectations about the material content of life are being moderated. So again, that's a sort of an adjustment process that doesn't say, now you must sacrifice. It's a sort of a realization that the times have changed. And what I'm trying to do is to put into the discussion that engenders the idea that actually we can be better off when we realize what makes for a good life. This is really all about trying to redefine what makes for a good life compared with what we've been told makes for a good life in a highly consumerist society. So much for sacrifice. As for population, I don't have anything very special to say about population. In this particular work I showed you, we assume that our National Statistical Agency, which does many projections of Canada's population, for the sustainable prosperity scenario, we assume it's the low projection, which is one of stability. Canada will still require quite a large number of immigrants to sustain that because our fertility rate is much below replacement rate. And so we'll still need about 100,000 net immigrants per year just to stabilize the population. And we have a bad habit in Canada of trying to attract people from poor countries who've got great skills or wealth to come to Canada, which may be great for Canada, but it's not very good for the countries that they leave. So the immigration thing is really quite multifaceted. As for the poorer countries, that's for them to deal with. We can make it a bit easier for them. We can make more space for them, as I said. We can provide more assistance. I think that what we've learned, and I'm sure you know all this, is that programs that support women make a difference to the number of children they want and can have. That's educating women in poor countries. I was a renewable energy advisor for 2.5 years in Kenya, so I had some direct exposure to the programs there, helping with nurseries, helping women get an income from growing trees and plants and so on. Lots of things that can be done. And I think, if I had to vote, that's where I would put the emphasis, not on draconian measures, trying to reduce numbers. I think that's just not acceptable.
When you ready? Yeah. Hi Peter, thanks for your talk. You talked about that you had to redo your model after the financial crisis. So I was wondering, now that you included finance, the world of finance and monetary policy, what kind of assumptions did you make? Like, what's the role of finance in getting to this perfect or the most positive scenario, and what kind of assumptions did you make on monetary policy?
Right, thank you for that. First of all, I want to say that we haven't gone far enough. What we do is we have the commercial banks, and we have the central bank, and we posit behaviours by both those institutions. So the commercial banks are assumed to give whatever loans firms and households want. We put a constraint on that. If the loans that households want in relation to their assets exceeds a certain level, then what the model does is no more loans to the households. What that then does is limit the amount of consumption that they can undertake, and it all feeds through the model. What we like about that is that it's very much in keeping with what I said before, and that is that money is created when banks make loans. We also have in the model what's called a capital adequacy ratio. In other words, banks are obliged by law to have a certain amount of capital in relation to the size of the number of loans they make. So we specify that. So that constrains what the banks can do. So we've got sort of the basic bits and pieces are in there. What the central bank does is it provides reserves to the commercial banks so that they can meet their capital adequacy ratio. And central banks, by the way, are just like the commercial banks. They can create money just on the computer. They do that, they buy bonds with it. That's what they did during to try and get us out of the financial crisis. This famous meeting at the US Senate, I recall, where somebody was asked the head of the Federal Reserve, where did the $7 trillion come from? Kind of shrugged his shoulders. Just do it. So I think what we tried to do is capture the main features of the banking system as we understand it. We've also got it so that the interest rate that the central bank sets that affects all the interest rates in the economy is in response to whatever happened to the unemployment rate. So the nice thing about the modeling approach is that we can now go back. We've reached a certain stage. We think we've got something we can present to the public, to our readers. We can go back and refine and improve as we want. There you are.
So, let the microphone catch up. There goes. Laura's going to get the last question, and then we'll let Mustafa close. But don't fret if you have a question, because we have an announcement coming of kind of the after party, where we might have an opportunity to mingle more. So, here's to Laura.
Then a very quick and specific question. In one of your answers just now, well, first of all, thank you for your talk. In one of the answers you just gave in this round, you said it's important to point out lacks in graphs or models, power. And I was just wondering, in the real economy, which you showed, you left out the unpaid work, and I was wondering if there is a specific reason for doing so.
Okay. Yes, you're right. Unpaid work is not explicitly in the model, but it's done during the non-paid work hours. So, there are economists who, I think I might have done it myself at the time, put a monetary value on unpaid work and then sort of count that as part of the output of the economy. I'm not really attracted to that because I think unpaid, it's very hard to define unpaid work, to say what it really consists of. So for example, I'm a parent and grandparent. I've never considered time spent with my children and grandchildren as any kind of work. You could, and we know how to put a money value on it. You say, well, what would it cost to hire somebody to do that? I just think it demeans the relationship that is really established when as a parent and child. So doing the dishes might be a different thing. Right? Cleaning house might, but so I just find that categorization problematic, and I don't think it helps to monetize it and then think you've dealt with it. But I do believe that it's not a bad thing to keep track of unpaid work and to ask questions about whether these appliances that we buy and use actually reduce unpaid work or increase unpaid work. Because, for example, when you have an appliance like a vacuum cleaner, it raises the standard which you're expected to keep your house. So you might spend as much time vacuuming as you did before with a broom, but you just get it cleaner. So, yeah, there's lots of good stuff to be said, and my good friend Kate Rayworth, who's in Stockholm at the same time, because we come to the same meeting in Stockholm, has quite a lot to say about that in her book on donut economics. There's a big literature on that. So we didn't include it, but I think it will.
Thank you. No? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Peter. So first thing is that we took a few pictures during the event. If you do not want to, we're gonna post them on our Facebook page. If you do not want to be in the page, on the page, just let us know. We will not post the picture that you are. Second of all, we like the conversation to keep on going. So we are going to Unico to discuss more, since we do not have more time here at the library. But also we're going to have another event on Friday. We're going to have a barbecue outside, so we can reflect on the events we had and also start talking about what do we want to do for the next semester and over the summer. And again, I want to thank CEMUS and Rethinking Economics Stockholm, and we would like to thank the library, City Library here. And of course, Peter, it has been an honor and a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much.